Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled to welcome you today, this afternoon, to our fourth Roski Talk of the semester. And this is the first one of the new Lunar New Year of the Ox. Woo woo. So thank you to Cognate Collective for helping us ring that in. My name is Jenny Lin, and I'm Associate Professor of Critical Studies in the Roski School of Art and Design. And I'm joined here today by curator and scholar Anu Vikram, who is teaching the related graduate level seminar for the Roski Talks. And Anu will be kindly helping to lead the Q&A following the talk by Cognate Collective today. So on behalf of Haven Linkirk, the Dean of the Roski School of Art and Design, and Suzanne Lacey, Professor of Art and Chair of the Roski Talk Committee, as well as all of our colleagues in USC's Roski School of Art and Design, I am thrilled to welcome you to this afternoon's Roski Talk. And the Roski Talks, as you know, are a series that features some of the brightest and most brilliant artists, designers, scholars, curators, and art professionals working today. Soon we are going to be hearing from Cognate Collective about their fantastic work at the intersections of art and social practice. And our graduate students will be introducing Cognate Collective in one moment. But first, I just want to let you know about some of the other fantastic Roski Talks that are coming up this semester. So I think, as all of you know, since you've made it this far, you can find out more information about upcoming Roski Talks and other events, and you can register to attend using the link roski.usc.edu/events. The next event is going to feature our very own Keith Mayerson, Roski Professor of Art and Painter Extraordinaire, next Wednesday, and then that's February 24th. Following that, on March 3rd, we will be having the Hantman Photography Lecture given to us by artist and photographer Carmen Winant. Following that, we will have a Roski Talk by TJ Dudu Norris on March 10th at 2 p.m. And then we will have a Roski Talk with Karen Fong, a designer, at 6 p.m. on March 11th. Next up will be artist Diedrich Brackens talking on March 17th at 2 p.m. Then we will have our very own, again, the brilliant theorist, professor, curator, and scholar Amelia Jones talking on March 31st at 2 p.m. Then we will have Gabriela Ortiaga, curator at MOLA, coming to us on April 14th at 2 p.m. And last but not least, we will have artist Simon Leung speaking on April 21st. So all of the talks are at Wednesdays at 2 p.m. unless otherwise noted. And we very much hope to see you at some of those future ones as well. So without much further ado, I will now hand it over to our fabulous first-year graduate students, Nawi Garcia, who is an MA student in Roski's Curatorial Practices in the Public Sphere program, as well as Erin Elaniak. No, she's going to tell you how she pronounces her last name, an MFA student in the art program, and they're going to introduce Cognate Collective to us. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm Erin Elaniak. And today, as Jenny said, we're joined by artists Misael Diaz and Amy Sanchez Arteaga, who work together as Cognate Collective. Since 2010, the pair has collaborated with trans-border communities to interrogate our understanding of the border, taking to task issues of citizenship, migration, informal economies, and popular culture. Through their interdisciplinary research-based practice, they seek to reimagine the border as a fluid space that expands and contracts with the movement of people and objects. Based between Los Angeles, Santa Ana, and Tijuana, their approach merges research projects, public interventions, and experimental pedagogies that collaboratively engage with those living along the US-Mexico border. Cognate Collective has shown internationally, including exhibitions in Germany, Ecuador, Mexico, and the US. Their work has been seen at LA's Craft Contemporary, the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, Instituto Municipal de Arte y Cultura in Tijuana, and the Armory Center for the Arts in Pasadena. They are the current artists in residence at Santa Monica's 18th Street Art Center, where they are working on their current project, Market Exchange, which seeks to document and theorize markets as important nodes of exchange within immigrant and working class communities. We're also looking forward to seeing their work for the forthcoming exhibition at LACE, Intergalactics Against Isolation. Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you both here today. Welcome, Amy and Misael.
Share screen?
I think so. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Erin. It was such a pleasure today to be able to digitally gather with some of the graduate students and see some of the wonderful production that's happening on campus. So we thank you all for the invitation and for this opportunity to exchange information and time I think like it's important to name in this sort of moment of isolation and in these opportunities for gathering that we have in this pandemic moment, each other's humanity, and I think also the kind of like sidedness of each of our sort of locations in this moment. And so to that end, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that we find ourselves seated on unceded Kumeyaay land. And I think that history of Indigenous resistance and stewardship the Kumeyaay have are articulated and embodied in their stewarding of the land over all of these millennia is an example of a kind of like deep connection to territory, to geography. And so I think we take a little bit of inspiration from that in the way that we hope to walk us through the kind of arc of the 4 projects that we're going to show today in our artist talk. So we're going to speak about 4 projects that have different geographic, but also kind of temporal relationships to the border as a site and as a kind of time frame. And we're going to begin by talking not about the work. I think our work, a lot of it that's best known is probably the work that we've developed in Tijuana, cited at the geopolitical like line, right, and within the kind of armature and infrastructure that is the border. And instead, we are going to begin by talking about this project that we did in the Imperial Valley, which is in southeastern California. It's a community where I grew up by nationally between the Imperial Valley and Mexicali, which is, so the 2 cities that neighbor each other are Calexico and Mexicali. But yeah, so this is where I sort of grew up. And in about, so between like 2010 and 2011, we learned about this space from friends who were collaborating with an organization that was organizing a migrant shelter. And in that moment, that shelter was being organized because there was this incredible sweeping moment of deportations that caused this crisis in these border communities. And so this kind of informal shelter space called the Hotel del Migrante organized itself to be able to house and feed people. I think at their peak, they were like housing and feeding between like 50 and 200 people a night. And so we learned about this space. We were invited to visit. And I think in this moment, and this is early in our collaboration together, I think we were thinking about the kind of cachet and the kind of symbolic function of works of art to broker exchange that went beyond the symbolic. And specifically, I think we were also, as students of art history and people who grew up with this kind of like working class, border kid context, thinking about like pop. And so both pop culture, but also like sort of like pop art. And so when we went to the shelter, one of the things that they let us know that they needed were donations of food. And so we found ourselves we went to this market, which is called California Supermarket, which you see here, which is right. So in the distance, it's sort of difficult to see, but like this fence that you see in the background is the US-Mexico border. So it's that close to the border. And so we went to this market because of its proximity, but also because I'd always really liked like the sign, and like I think there was also just like an architectural sort of like interest in this space, but also because they sell mayoreo y menudeo, like ¿cómo se dice? Like wholesale stuff, right? And so we had this interest in like looking for wholesale opportunities to purchase things to donate to the shelter. And so we talked to one of the managers, and they gave us permission to walk through the market and take photographs of the different products. And so then we ended up with these photos, and we're thinking about these like photos of these cans of food, and we're quite interested in thinking about like, okay, how could we mobilize a system to amass donations in our work? And so what we decided to do, what we came to, is this project called 32 Cans, where we in the gallery, these are presented as these kind of postcard prints, and we sold the can for the price that was noted in the grocery store, and then in the kind of brokering of that transaction, the collecting of that artwork, the collector is also purchasing this can in the store. So we go back, and then using the money from the purchase of the print, we collected those cans of food to donate to the shelter. And so this is a picture of me with my little brother. This is in probably like 2014, right? Taking the money from, so that was us selling or doing the kind of transformation of the postcards as art object in print back into this kind of materiality, this kind of version of this pragmatic need, right, that we were going to try to address at the market. And this is us like unloading at the Hotel del Migrante. I think an important, or I guess something that I think about and that we've thought about together a lot, it's like these different permutations of the way that the border manifests over time. And I think the way that from a distance, so those of us who have not spent, those of us who've not spent a lot of time at the space of the crossing, and not spent a lot of time at this kind of embodied site of the borderlands, like waiting in line to cross, there's this kind of abstracted notion of the border as a kind of monolithic and a impermeable, permanent object. And so that's not true. The contemporary border between the US and Mexico is quite recent. It's like 200 years old, which is, I mean, like fairly recent. In our lifetimes, the way that it has looked, felt, been militarized, I think different crossing points all kind of have a different character and a different way that manifests at the level of the body. And so in our work, I think we think about that specificity. So part of thinking about that specificity meant also then talking to some of the folks who were spending time at the shelter, who were either awaiting repatriation or who were hoping to cross again. And so what you'll notice is that in a lot of this work, the bodies of those people are absent. That's both for like security reasons and like confidentiality, and people just not maybe wanting to be included in that, and which we respect, but also because I think of the kind of like hyper visibility and the narratives that are crafted around those bodies and those individuals. I think that's a choice that we made. But there was still a desire, I think, on the part of a lot of those communities and a lot of these individuals that we met to still share that story and share that context. And so that led to this interest for us in kind of creating threads and creating these connections between this version and this experience of the crossing as an experience of border, and triangulating that with the space of the port of entry, which was a place that we started to develop a lot of work starting in around 2010, specifically the San Isidro port of entry in Tijuana. And so Misa is going to speak about that production a little bit.
Yeah, so Amy was sharing a little bit about her history in the Imperial Valley. My family grew up
Deseo que todo pudiera ser como en un sueño que sigo teniendo.
in Tijuana, and I grew up crossing the border consistently and pretty constantly between Tijuana and San Diego, and spending a lot of time at the port of entry, which is where cars and people line up to cross into the United States from Mexico. And I think my experience of the border had been this process of waiting in line, boredom, but nonetheless, I think this fluidity, right, of movement. And I think that is an experience that, of course, is born from privilege, but it was also an experience that felt valuable to think through and consider, this act of rejecting the rigidity of the border that Amy was speaking to. Interestingly, around the time that we began to work at the port of entry in 2010, you had the simultaneous acceleration of deportations happening at the border, and also the redevelopment of the actual infrastructure for the crossing to facilitate movement, to actually allow more people to cross, to prevent stagnation at the crossing and accelerate the movement of consumers, essentially, from Tijuana into San Diego to purchase and contribute to the economy on this side of the border. So you had a recognition of the kind of interconnectedness of this region economically, not to say anything about like culture, which is also incredibly powerful. And at the same time, you had the kind of increase of militarization and machinations to essentially foreclose the actual movement and possibility for migration. So we were interested in tracing and thinking through this tension, through this duality of experience of moving across the border on a semi-regular, even daily basis, and also the kind of experience of having to go through very dangerous, violent, dehumanizing forms of crossing through the desert, through much more dangerous, unregulated ports of entry. And as Amy was sharing, when we were doing the work in migrant shelters along the border, we began to collect some of these testimonies. We felt just sharing the kind of recordings in and of themselves didn't really feel like a complete work or like a complete process, in part because so many of the people that we were speaking with in the shelters, were experiencing a very vulnerable, precarious condition and situation. And I think it just felt like broadcasting their testimonies was a little bit, I don't know, like of a gesture that would further kind of this process of potentially even like exploitation that they were already confronting. So what we decided to do instead was to think about a way of conflating these two experiences of moving across the border. The experience of being deported and having to face the prospect of crossing through the desert and quite literally risk one's life to cross, and the experience of crossing on foot or in a car via port of entry, like those in San Isidro. So what we decided to do was to transcribe portions of testimonies that we collected within the shelters and take them to the crossing where we had folks who were waiting in line on foot read those portions of testimonies aloud. And so we wanted to share just one example of one of these. You'll hear the version that someone read in Spanish, and then you'll hear the version that someone read in English.
And I also want to mention that the photo is like contemporaneous to when this was recorded. So the port of entry actually looks quite different now, but this photograph was taken in around 2011 when these recordings were made.
Deseo que todo pudiera ser como en un sueño que sigo teniendo. Estamos en el desierto y tengo tanta sed. Mi piel se quema debajo de mi ropa y puedo sentir el calor de la arena debajo de mis zapatos. Mi corazón retumba en mi pecho y siento que mi respiración es superficial. Somos más de 10 y camino detrás del grupo, al último. Una mujer que conozco en la realidad camina frente de mí. Trabajaba conmigo en los fields del otro lado antes de que me deportaran. Ella me voltea a ver y se mira asustada. Me dice que hay algo mal con mi espalda, que parecen tumores o algo así. Siento comezón y cuando alzo mi mano para sentir mi piel debajo de mi camisa, toco plumas. Es entonces que me doy cuenta que tengo alas y le digo que hay algunos de nosotros que podemos volar, pero la gente no lo intenta por miedo a morir. Y entonces empiezo a volar, empiezo a volar, empiezo a volar.
I wish it could be like a dream I keep having. We're in the desert and I am so thirsty. My skin burns through my clothes and I can feel the heat and the sand through my tennis shoes. My heart is pounding in my chest and my breath feels like shallow. There are no more than 10 of us and I walk at the very back of the group. A woman who I know in real life walk ahead of me. She worked with me in the fields on the other side before I was deported. She turns to look at me and she looks frightening. She tells me there is something wrong with my back, like I have tumors or something. I feel itching on my shoulder blades. And then I reach under my shirt to feel my back. I feel feathers. That's when I realize I have wings. And I say to her that some of us can fly, but people don't try because they're too afraid to die. Then I fly away.
So those are just two readings that we collected at the port of entry. And I think it was a really interesting experience in asking folks to read them aloud because I think it facilitated this recognition of the drastic disparity of experiences in crossing, the kind of seemingly cruel and also absurdist fact that moving from south to north can be so different depending on abstract things like documentation and just different forms of privilege that one is born into and it has access to arbitrarily.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting experience and we wanted to do something with the audio. Around this time, we had been thinking about ways of not just intervening on this kind of small personal scale through these personal engagements with individuals waiting in line to cross to facilitate a kind of process of reflection around what it means to cross a border and the potential to conceptualize this act of crossing as a form of transgression, but to really kind of amplify that engagement to try to essentially cover the entirety of the port of entry, to try to reach all the folks that were gathering in this space every day. There's around 90,000 people or so that cross the port of entry every day. So it's a space of mass gathering, but it's also a space of very minimal engagement. You don't really engage with others. If anything, you engage with vendors, but even then, it's a very kind of economic transaction and form of communication. So we wanted to try to develop platforms to engage with folks that were waiting in line to cross and activate this kind of process of reflection. And we decided to begin our forays into radio because radio is one of the things that you do, or one of the things that you do is you listen to music, you listen to the radio while you're waiting in line to cross. It can take you up to like an hour and a half, 2 hours on average to cross the border. So you have a lot of time on your hands, and the radio is one of the things that, you know, can help you pass the time. So we decided to begin broadcasting testimonies that we collected, like the ones that you just heard, other recordings, oral histories that we began to collect of folks who had worked at the crossing for generations, and to broadcast them from inside of a market that's located at the port of entry. And that led to an interest in trying to orchestrate a kind of more performative version of these broadcasts and these dialogues and conversations.
I would say too.
Yeah. More nomadic version of that. And so we decided to essentially compile all of our radio technology that would live inside of a market previously into a car, so that we could actually record and broadcast from inside a car as we were also waiting in line to cross. So that led to this project, Dialogue in Transit, that has been an ongoing series of interventions that we've done at the port of entry, where we invite different artists and activists and scholars to join us inside of the cruiser, which is this car that you see here, to have a conversation about the border. We've done versions of these where we're thinking specifically about important historical shifts in the evolution of the border. So we did an entire kind of conference inside of cars, thinking about NAFTA and the impact of free trade and neoliberal economic policies in essentially amplifying the types of economic exploitative dynamics that were always present or that have been present at the border for a long time to other parts of the country of Mexico. And we also did ones that were thinking specifically about things like music. We invited Josh Kuhn, who teaches at USC, to give us a kind of oral history of the border and of music relating to the border. And these are all conversations that we, again, have inside of the car. We record them to upload subsequently and distribute through SoundCloud as these kind of podcasts. And we're also simultaneously broadcasting them to the port of entry via radio. So if you're waiting at the port of entry while we're doing one of these crossings, you can tune your radio to 87.9 FM and essentially listen into the conversation.
Yeah, I also think that it's important to mention that, so on top of the car, there's also like a perifoneo, a little like speaker that is playing to the folks who are also working in line at the crossing, because when we did like the very first one, we had our radio, like we were trying to project the sound out, but our friends who worked and who were like shopkeepers and ambulant vendors at the border were like, could it be louder? And so the idea for the perifoneo, I think, was a really nice adaptation in response to this kind of community demand.
Yeah, so this is a video where you can kind of hear some of it.
Yeah.
Yerga un altar sobre este lecho. Yerga un altar sobre este lecho. Camine por los alrededores silbando una melodía bélica repleta de flores. Procures enemigos para atarlos y llevarlos hacia el oratorio.
Yeah, and like I said, this has been an ongoing project of ours where we've done crossings at the port of entry, but we've also adapted this work to do mobile broadcasts. Most recently, one in Santana. We were artists and residents at Grand Central Art Center.
I'm just putting it back.
For a while.
Yeah, for like 5 years.
We were longtime artists and residents at Grand Central, and we worked with the Santana chapter of Chulita Vinyl Club to do mobile transmission and essentially like trip through the city where they were recalling spaces, neighborhoods that were of significance to them, given the fact that Santana is undergoing a very intense process of gentrification. So we invited them to do this mobile broadcast as a way of kind of reflecting on the histories of working class Mexican and Latinx communities in Santana. And this work in thinking about how it is to expand not just the kind of technical approaches and methodologies that we've developed at the border to other sites, but also the conceptual interests in thinking through what the border looks like in different spaces has also opened up an opportunity to think more broadly about the problematics at the border that we have been researching and thinking through, how those problematics relate to broader restrictive understandings of citizenship and belonging, and how processes of gentrification lead to forms of displacement that essentially, like cause harm to communities of color. And I think in some ways mimic the ways in which capital essentially drives these waves of movement, right? Of forced movement and forced displacement of communities that we've been encountering at the border, especially most recently in relation to Central American migrants. So we were interested in kind of tracing these connections between forms of displacement in the form of migration and problematics at the border to other histories of displacement as it relates to probably like I would say like limited, restrictive understandings of who counts as a citizen and rights pertaining to citizenship.
Mm-hmm. And so I think to sort of speak about that, but I think also an important piece of this research and an important piece of this part of our practice has been to think about the specificity of citing sound and of citing stories of a particular location within that site, that historical site. And so here we have a photograph or like a kind of like a map of First Street North, which is this block in Little Tokyo. And in the summer of 2019, we were invited by Little Tokyo Service Center, which is a wonderful social service organization in Little Tokyo, to do an artist residency and to think about the histories and sort of legacy of this block and of the fact that it's this site, as Misael sort of points to, I think, with the work in Santana, this site that is undergoing this kind of this similar process of redevelopment that is not acknowledging or supportive or I think in any way being respectful of the histories of this context and of the kind of work of resistance and community-based organizing that has taken place in this neighborhood. And so as we think and as we thought about how to be in solidarity with this kind of process of advocating for this kind of last a block of land that is slated for redevelopment, when we thought about like what are the ways that we can be in solidarity, one of the gestures that we found ourselves thinking of is this approach of thinking about sound and thinking about radio, and also the potential and the capaciousness of telling speculative stories. So stories that are informed by history and informed by the past, but that offer a kind of vision of the future that is manifest and has the futurity and the transformative capacity that folks from the neighborhood could really kind of like dream into. So thinking about these kind of capacious futures. So Future Echoes, so that's the kind of like conceptual, I guess, underpinning of this project. But it was this kind of insight. So this insight sound installation that was up for 2 weeks in downtown Little Tokyo. I think we thought, we thought a lot about this image as well. So this image is one that we found when we were actually doing research in Arizona around one of the sites that would become a concentration camp, where Japanese American folks were incarcerated during the Second World War. And this is an image that was a part of this archive that had to do with this other sort of set of research that we were doing, where radios were thought to maybe contain like some kind of secret technology that could like communicate secrets. And so this is somebody surrendering or having the radio like inspected by the LAPD in this moment of mass incarceration that J folks experience. And so I think as we really like thought about the kind of resonance and these kinds of histories of detainment, of incarceration, and simultaneously as we were in this residency, we're experiencing this crisis at the border of family separation and detention, we began to work with artist Tracy Katukiriyama, who is one of the other artists in residence, to look at historic letters, or they were looking at these historic letters of detention that were part of the JANM archive. And at the same time, we were thinking about these letters that the organization Freedom for Immigrants was writing to folks who were currently in detention specifically at the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is a detention center here in San Diego County. And so in doing that, sort of in kind of thinking about those historical resonances together, we participated in, Tracy was hosting this kind of series of letter writing spaces. And so we recorded some of those letters. And so that was part of what was included, for instance, in the Future Echoes audio, which was also this kind of like sculptural dome that we put out on the plaza in front of JANM for a few evenings. And then we, so the audio is also online. So we're just playing a fragment today because there was also wonderful works that were written by, so like folks like TK Lei, Kenji Liu, Vicky Vertiz, like wonderful writers contributed these kinds of speculative fiction stories that folks could listen to in the dome, while also then listening to these other sort of, I think, echoes from past and present within the space of the dome. So are we gonna play, we're gonna play just a section of that audio.
Yeah, and so again, what you'll hear is someone reading aloud a story or a letter that was written by someone who's currently at the Otay Mesa Detention Center. And also we had folks reply to some of these letters. So you'll hear someone reading aloud a reply letter that we sent through this organization to folks currently in detainment at the detention center.
I am coming from Honduras asking for asylum because they killed my son in front of me. They invaded my home and shot down my son while I was in the middle of cooking him a meal. I don't have any family in the United States, but I am afraid to return to Honduras because the man that killed my son was threatening me because he, the killer, was afraid that I would recognize him. And I decided to leave my land for fear that I would be killed. I have all the proof that this happened, and I would like to ask for your help.
Hello, hola. ¿Cómo está? Espero que bien. Our hearts are with you, and I hope you'll be free to live a good and happy life. My family was also in a camp detention center for 3 years during World War II. They did not tell me about it, but I learned that our whole community, Japanese Americans, were in camps because the U.S. thought they were the enemy. We were not, and you are not, the enemy. It was hard for my grandparents who came to the U.S. as immigrants, but we survived. Today we want to speak out for people being treated unfairly and not let this government imprison you or others who just want a better life. You deserve a better life, and we will work hard to change this country and stop the hate. This is a country of all people, all immigrants. Keep hoping and fighting. Kathy.
Are you going to mention that thing about Kathy?
No, you can mention it.
Oh, I don't.
Oh, so I just wanted to quickly mention that the voice that you hear at the end is Kathy Masaoka, who today was actually testifying as part of the hearings for the HR 40 bill on reparations for African Americans, sharing her testimony and the experience of the Japanese American community fighting for reparations and for acknowledgement of the violence of detainment that the Japanese and Japanese American community faced in World War II. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of give a
She's awesome. Shout out to Kathy. So I think
I am coming from Honduras.
Sorry, so in this kind of so this is the dome space. In this kind of exterior gathering space, the public was invited to come and sit down, put on a pair of headphones, listen to these stories. But the broadcast was actually audible on all of the First Street North block. And so subsequently that archive of recordings was pressed into the LP that just appeared on the screen, but it's accessible. So it's been archived. It's part of the archive. Well, the Little Tokyo Service Center has one, as well as some of the other community partners. So it's available in that form through those organizations, but then it's also available online through this bit.ly link. And I think we'll end, we have just a couple of minutes, so maybe should I just speak about this one quickly? So so this is a work called Regresami, Come Back to Me, that we showed. So this is the installation of it at the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego. And essentially, I think in this work is a culmination of a lot of research that we were doing around sort of forms of cultural production in market spaces within public markets in Southern California. And thinking about these veladoras, these 7-day candles, as a tool potentially for advocating for political demands and for a kind of end to carcerality for communities of color. And I think thinking broadly about the kind of connections in this piece. So there was a couple, so there was 3 versions of the candle, or 4?
Four, because it's bilingual.
Yeah, so it's bilingual. So on these candles on the backs, they either have this kind of incantation that this sort of spell where the reader, the participant in the performance, some of whom we see here. So in the performance, we invite the public to light these candles alongside us. We invoke Santa Marta or Saint Martha, who we can, if folks have interest in that mythology, we're happy to talk more about it maybe in the Q&A, but we kind of invoke her as our patron to make a kind of collective gesture of willing an end toward carcerality. And specifically, this work also then includes a testimony. So I think in thinking about, that's another theme maybe that runs through these works, includes the testimony of David Ortega, who was a queer person who was detained at Otay Mesa Detention Center at the time that we were producing this work. So also triangulating the space and the kind of community context of the museum with the space of detention located in our very community. And it was a performance that took place as part of this kind of evening celebration of the show that it was in. It was, what was the name of the show? Being Here With You, which was at the Museum of Contemporary at San Diego in 2018, I think. So these are just some images of that installation, but I think the fact that there was so many community members and also so many members of the binational community that participated in the lighting of these candles and in the performance of this work made it just like a really, I think it's the most, maybe like in terms of a performance and in terms of our own like emotional capacity and endurance, I think made this both really powerful and also just like quite heavy and interesting. And I think for us and for those of you who are in the seminar and were able to take a look at the reading that we assigned, I think our I don't know if I said this earlier, but I think a lot of the times when we talk about sites like the border, we talk about things like violence. It's very easy to for those kinds of abstractions to not have a texture or not have a feeling or not have, they're just like in the world in a way that is intangible. And so I think in our work, maybe as a summary, something that we hope to do, seek to do, is hold up a kind of specificity to those abstractions, right? To make them land. And to contextualize them for ourselves so that we can dialogue about them, so that we can engage around them and we can begin to find some form of healing or some form of common ground or some form of, I think, wrestling with some of these big structural contexts of violence. So that's all I have to say about our work. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think that's okay. I think we can open it up for Q&A to see if folks have any questions specifically about any of the works, and we're happy to speak about any of them a bit more, depending on what resonated with folks and if, they're curious about any aspects of it.
We'll give people a moment to add their comments to the Q&A. In the meantime, would you please tell us more about Saint Marta?
Yeah. So Santa Marta is a really interesting saint in that her history, and I think it's particularly like in these candles, there's two representations of her that circulate. The first is, or actually, do you want to pull that up, Misael, while I talk about it? So the first is a more traditional kind of almost like Marian kind of Catholic imagery, which you see on the left, where it's like she's holding her little Bible, but we always see her with a snake or with a kind of like monster figure. And the other is a version that comes to us actually more from Caribbean and more Yoruba sort of diasporic etymology and legacy of figuration, right? So there's these two versions in terms of representation on the candles. And so, but it's also important to say that Santa Marta, Saint Martha is the sister of Lazarus in the Bible. So she is the one who I think, like, my reading of this story is, so this is like my interpretation. I don't know if this is biblically how this shows up, is that she's the one that makes the demand. So she's the person who says, like, hey, like, heal my brother, right? So she is like a really interesting voice, I feel, of complaint. But the reason that she becomes like canonized and ultimately becomes a saint is because her like miraculous thing that she does is that she's living in like a French village, I believe, and there is this monster that was like terrorizing the village or the town that she's living in, and so it's just like eating people, and it's this really mean monster. And so she goes and she finds the monster, and what I think is great about the telling of the story is, or in a couple of the tellings, is that they write that she binds the monster to her girdle. So she like ties it to herself in this way, and she is able to kind of subdue it in such a way that then the monster is brought back to the village. So, and then together they like kill the monster. So it's not that Santa Marta is a figure. She's a dragon slayer, but the way that she slays is, I think, for us, what was really of interest, in that she gathers the collective. She makes this invitation to the people, to her community, to broker this kind of and to come up and to, I think, do justice, right, in the situation. And so I think she's the person who we invoke in this performance, in that she is this kind of voice, I think, of systemic upheaval that we would like to appeal to. And I think also the fact that she has this connection to not just a kind of Catholic sainthood and personhood, but also other, I think she's important to other forms of religious practices that are pre-Columbian in the Americas, is also important in the work. So thank you, Anu, for that question.
Thank you. So we have a question from Suzanne.
Oh,
she
cool.
asks about your research practice. So you mentioned your multi-year residency in Santa Ana, and obviously all of these projects have been quite intensively researched. So could you talk a little bit about how you approach and understand research as part of your artistic practice?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we both have a background more in research than in art making.
Production, yeah.
So we are coming from more like humanities sort of backgrounds in undergrad, at least. And so when we first started working at the port of entry, it was a desire to do something that had a kind of like visual component, but really the kind of methodologies that we employed on the ground to begin engaging with communities were a lot more based on like oral history, gatherings, on processes of ethnography and out of ethnography that I think were coming from, you know, a more research oriented
or like I think like also thinking about interdisciplinary like methodologies toward research.
Yeah. So I think that that's really our formation, and that eventually led to forms of collaboration with folks to try to visualize some of that research. But it's always been, I think, important for us to also conduct not just research in terms of archives and in terms of more like, you know, established forms of histories, but also to undertake forms of communicating and facilitating conversation with folks to hear from them their experience of certain sites or certain dynamics, and to really, I think, fold those into the processes of research that we undertake. Yeah, so it's always been important, and sometimes it's the kind of initial prompting of reaching out to community members, reaching out to community leaders, that will prompt a kind of interesting problematic that we then research further. Or other times it's archival research, like in the case of Future Echoes, where we stumbled upon this image of someone, of radios being confiscated, and that opened up into this larger project of engaging other folks in processes of sharing histories relating to Little Tokyo, and also imagining the future of Little Tokyo, that ultimately found its way into this audio work that we did. So it's kind of yeah, it's all through our practice, and sometimes it's, yeah, we also undertake a kind of like writing practice, so it's kind of enmeshed in ways that are very much foundational, and like part of the infrastructure of how it is that we work.
Yeah, I think I would also add that it can be very tangential. Like, I think we can, as there's threat, or like as we were walking everybody through, and I was like, oh, there's actually from the inception these kinds of curiosities, or this kind of question, or where we're just like, oh, I wonder about that, and then I think we really like indulge our curiosity, and I think we, because of the kind of shared interest that we have, I think we allow and enable each other in really sort of mining things that maybe seem like loosely connected, but are still interesting, and where we still feel like we're learning something. And I think that often that lays out a path toward other work and other projects. So for the students, I would say that it is like, indulge your curiosity, because that can be actually so productive.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Andy Campbell, who says, thank you so much for your work and your wonderful narration of its development and its political stakes. To say it is inspirational is an understatement. I have a question about the development of some of this work, which you mentioned was made during a long-term residency at Grand Central Art Center, 5 years. How did the residency parameters or lack of them support the development of the work? What was possible in the longer residency situation that wouldn't have otherwise been possible for you as artists? And I would add to that, only maybe in contrast to like a shorter residency term for you is like a year at Little Tokyo. I don't know if you've worked in shorter duration than that, but it seems like all of your projects do take sort of a minimum of a year to maybe several years to realize. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's, thank you for that question, Andy. And I we're like slow people, like, and we don't, and I mean that like is like not with the value judgment. I think like people just like work at different rates, and our rate is kind of slow. And also I think we do well with like little amounts of space at a time, if that makes sense. So I think even like in Tijuana, we started by working with like a couple of shop owners within this like very small market, and then after a couple of years thought like, oh, okay, like maybe we can do work like between the cars and with more pedestrians, and then slowly that sort of worked. But I mean, we have now in one capacity or another worked in and with the people in that market space for like a decade. Like we started working there in 2010. So I just think that there is like that residency, and the fact that we were there for 5 years was also because I think we're really clear that from the outset of the residency, that part of our interest in working in Santana was thinking about like the histories of migration, and also the fact that there were it's such a Mexican city. It's a lot of Mexican migrants there. And so a lot of people, when we got there, had a connection to Tijuana. And so initially it was supposed to be a short residency where we just had a show. But then I got into graduate school at UCI, so we were going to be able to be nearby anyway. So we were like, okay, we'll stick around and sort of like, see through some of the research that we were doing. And then that led to commitment and like friendships, and just like connections where it felt like it would have felt, I think, both disingenuous, and also like we weren't seeing through the work to its full potential if we had ended those projects sooner. And I think the other part of it is then that led to like a solo exhibition that we did that then was able to triangulate like the work we were doing at the same time, like in Tijuana, with some of the works we had done in Los Angeles, and put that into conversation with so it was also like this work of culling a whole like region, or like culling the production that we had made in a whole region into a kind of like intelligible document of that production. So I think the parameters of the residency were very open, and I think enabled us to work at the pace, but also in the like, sometimes when I think about it, I get like tired, just like remember like the being right in like multiple sites at once, across that amount of time was, so that was really helpful. And yes, we I don't know.
Yeah.
Is there anything you wanna...
Yeah, I think I'll also say that one of the things that was important about that work is that we hadn't had like any previous connection with Santana.
Yeah.
And the position of Grand Central in and of itself was somewhat part of conversations that were taking place within the community around gentrification.
Mhm.
So we were kind of navigating this role of needing to, I think, show that our interests and commitments to community were, I think, not, I think we're like genuine / I think we're like thinking about the politics of being in solidarity with those communities more so than I think fitting into this system of like quick turnarounds of shows and exhibitions, especially ones that are like community engaged. And I think to really do that sort of work in Santana, we felt like we really needed to essentially engage with community on their terms, more so than on ours. So a lot of times the work that we ended up doing there didn't end up manifesting as like an artwork that you could show somewhere, or that, you know, really had like a recognizable form as art, but was really just showing up and being in support and whatever needed to happen within the community as they were organizing against gentrification efforts, as they were organizing in like defense groups, like community defense groups against deportations, as they were just essentially organizing the community to be able to, you know, to exist and to have a kind of say in determining their political future. So I think one of the amazing things about the residency is that it really allowed us to do that in a way that felt like it was engaging with community on their terms,
on community's terms,
community's terms, and I think ultimately, I think for us felt like a nice way of really demonstrating like how sometimes to be in solidarity with communities means, you know, like it can look in different ways, and sometimes those ways don't end up, you know, fitting into the molds or categories that we have for art, even within like this broader term of social practice. So I think it was a really valuable experience that that I think allowed us to really think through the conceptual and theoretical dimensions of theorizing this region in relation to borders and to problematics of citizenship, but also to just kind of be in solidarity with like communities that were undergoing important political struggles.
Well, and Andy points out that there's a book that also collects a lot of this research, and that's great because it both shows all of the material that you've been able to acquire and develop, but also because it lets the projects live on in perpetuity, which is so wonderful. So again, I want to thank you so much for being here today. As always, it's such a great pleasure to hear from you both, and the way that you approach your work with such care and compassion. And I like that slow. I think slow art is still, you know, something we should aspire to. I do want to quickly mention that the Dean's Lunch series tomorrow features Cello Montoya in conversation with Suzanne Lacey at noon, where I think a lot of the conversation ideas that we've been talking about right now will be picked up again. And so I hope you'll all tune in for that as well. And now with that, those of you who are in the seminar, please join us we'll give it till 3:10 so people can take a bio break. So we'll see you there. And of course, faculty, you're welcome to join us. It's always the same link for the seminar. Everybody else, thank you so much for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you next time, which is next Wednesday at 2 p.m. for Keith Mayerson. All right, thanks so much.